Everyone. This is a video about creating an interview protocol. So I'm going to go through several different ways to think about creating an interview protocol. And as I do so, I'd like you to be writing down interview questions, jotting down ideas, developing things as we go along. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see PowerPoint slideshow. Okay, so this was developed in concert with Dr. Strom and myself. As I go through, I just wanted you to keep that in mind. First thing I want you to do is to think about your topic. So if you were going to conduct an interview, what kinds of topics would you like to discuss? Look at your research question. That's the most important thing. What questions does your research question imply? And then jot down a list of several items. They can either be topics or they can be questions. So for example, instruction is kind of a broad category. So if your research question, you were interested in the instruction that was happening in a particular classroom, but are you interested in inquiry-based teaching methods? Are you interested in the teacher's conceptualization of theories that underlie instruction? Are you interested in democratic approaches to classroom management? So really be thinking about how your interview questions are used to narrow and guide, essentially what kinds of information you're going to get. And when you look at your research question and then you look at your interview questions, there's kind of a breathing back and forth. Your research questions should guide your interview questions, but sometimes also when you formulate your interview questions, you end up revising your research question because you realize you wanted to know something at a certain level of specificity that is not in your research question. So take a moment to jot down your ideas. Definitely have your research question in front of you right now. All right, so you've got some ideas on paper, you have your research question in front of you, and now you should be brainstorming questions. Opening questions generally should be easy and inviting. They shouldn't be threatening. You can ask about experiences like, so tell me about how you decided to become a school counselor. It could be factual. How long have you been teaching? These kinds of questions help put people at their ease. They create a little bit of a conversational dialogue. Moving on from there, you can ask tour questions. You can ask participants to provide a broad overview. Can you describe your typical day as a school principal at Lincoln Elementary? You can think about questions, and when folks ask a tour question, you always want to ask for examples because someone might say, well, my typical day is, I come in, I do some discipline actions, then I go observe some teachers. But you might want to stop them and say, well, what do those discipline actions consist of? Give me an example, right? So ask participants to provide information on specific instances. It's very helpful to generate stories. In the end, when you go to analyze your data, you'll find it's wonderful to have these stories that, oh, well, the other day, a teacher brought a student into my office who was having trouble focusing in class, and here's what I did as part of the discipline, right? So when they tell a story, you have something really rich to do your analysis on. You might also ask timeline questions where you ask about a series of events. So an example, tell me about your career path leading up to becoming assistant superintendent of Deer Creek School District. That's a kind of timeline question you might ask if you're really interested in how people become what they become, right? Like what is it that led, for example, if you're researching the lives of Black women teachers, like what is it that led them to become a teacher? That's quite a timeline question. You can also ask timeline questions about events at a district or a school. So I often ask questions around, tell me about how certain capacity ended up being developed or certain resources ended up being developed. So how did you end up aligning your schedules to be able to do learning together? So then I'm asking for folks to tell me a story of a specific series of events that ended up with them having aligned schedules. You can ask hypothetical questions asking them to imagine a scenario. For example, if you were in charge of athletics at your school district, what changes would you make? And actually asking people how they would change things or how they want things to be different can always be very interesting, because you get at, what are their hopes and dreams? What do they want to see differently? And also, what barriers do they see? Hypothetical questions are also useful when you are researching social justice aspects. People may be hesitant to answer questions about racial injustice, and sometimes hypothetical questions can help get into that. And by the way, you don't ever have to have every single one of these kinds of questions on your interview protocol. In fact, I really advise that you don't have every one of these kinds of questions on your protocol. These are just different ways to think about an interview. You can try different ones out, but I really want you to land on a series of questions that get at exactly what you want. Another kind of question is the ideal situation questions. So describe your ideal situation, your perfect day of teaching, your perfect observation. This again gets at a sense of what they're hoping or dreaming. Like, what is it that they want to see, and how is it, you can even then ask, how is it that they might get there? You can ask folks to compare and contrast, to consider one category in relation to another. How is working in the CSU East Bay Counseling Center different from your past position counseling at Mills? A lot of times when I research professional development, I might ask teachers to compare the professional development they're receiving with us with past professional development. As you ask questions, always be simple and clear. Avoid jargon, avoid acronyms, avoid asking very convoluted questions. Ask only about one thing at a time. I know that sounds simple, but it's very easy to ask what we call double-barreled questions. So to ask for two things at once, they get a little bit confused, and it's really hard to answer, like, do I answer the one, do I answer the other? So try to just ask one thing at a time. Generally speaking, it's good to have open-ended questions. If it's a yes or no question, then you would follow it up with, can you explain why, or what is an example? Try to be straightforward and non-leading. Try to be neutral. This can be a problem occasionally, especially if participants are not kind of giving you what you think you should see. But really, aside from maybe posing some hypothetical questions, you don't want to, make them think a particular thing. For example, in terms of, again, racial inequality, I might ask something like, I might pose the idea, other folks I've talked to have encountered issues with racism as a teacher. Is that something you've ever encountered? So I might say that someone else I've talked to has encountered something that opens up the possibility that that could be true. But when I ask them if they've ever encountered it, I am not implying that they have, right? I'm not saying for sure you must have encountered this. Often I will write down follow-ups and probing questions so that I remember them, but although I don't always ask them. And then definitely avoid why questions if you can. Using the word why can put people off. You can use instead what or how, like what influenced you to come to this professional development. So what influenced you is a great way to avoid using the word why. Right, so go back to your list of topics and your list of questions. Using the different things I talked about, formulate 5 to 8 questions. Think about what type they are. Are there any other ways to maybe formulate them? Are there any other things you want to get at? And then this is a really important step. What do you think you're going to expect to get in terms of answers? So you can almost even ask yourself in your head, if someone asked me this, what kinds of answers would I provide? And that's where we also can double check on closed questions, a yes or no question, or leading questions. So we really want to kind of check through and make sure we don't have any of those. We want to check and make sure we don't have any double-barreled questions where we're asking 2 things at once. And we also want to make sure that we are really on target with our topics. There can be kind of two mistakes. One is getting too far afield, so asking too many different things and the interview goes too long and we don't get enough depth. And the other is being too narrow and you don't get enough about what you're hoping to see. I really think one of my absolutely most important pieces of advice is asking for examples and example stories. So really asking folks to tell the story of how something happened or of what happened, because that's where you get that depth. When you go to reorder the questions, definitely you want to start mellow. You want to build trust. If you have really sensitive questions, you want to ask them towards the end, after you've kind of developed a rapport with a person. And you generally want to group questions about the same general idea together, because then questions can build on one another. And in fact, a lot of times someone will answer a question that is later in the interview protocol. And in fact, sometimes I don't end up asking questions later in the interview protocol if they've already answered them. Right. So that's a little bit about developing an interview protocol. There is an example on Blackboard, so you can see an example interview protocol. If you want to see any other examples, please email me. I have many example protocols. Enjoy the process of creation. I think it will help you to think through the interview protocol as well as think back on your research questions. What is it that you really want to know?